When U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren tried to mock Ibrahim Traore on live TV, she expected applause. Instead, she was met with one of the most powerful and unexpected clapbacks ever seen on television. Traore's brutal yet dignified response left Warren in tears, silenced the room, and lit up social media worldwide. This video reveals the fiery exchange that shocked millions and proved why Traore's voice carries so much weight globally. The U.S. Senate chamber was buzzing. Reporters filled the seats, cameras rolled, and the world was watching. This wasn't an ordinary hearing. It was the Foreign Relations Committee discussing U.S.-Africa trade. At the center of attention sat Senator Elizabeth Warren, 76 years old, sharp-eyed, and known for her fiery speeches. But across the ocean, joining live through video link, was a much younger figure, President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, only 37. His calm expression on the big screen filled the room with an energy no one expected. Everyone knew this wasn't just about trade. It was about power. It was about who gets to define the future. When Warren leaned forward, smirking slightly, the room sensed something was about to happen. She tapped her microphone and said in a sharp tone, "Mr. Traore, your so-called economic reforms look like dictator cosplay economics. Africa deserves real leaders, not costume parades." A few people chuckled. Some clapped lightly. The insult was bold, cutting, and live on C-SPAN. But Traore did not flinch. He raised his eyes slowly, the silence growing heavy. The world was about to witness something unforgettable. The insult hung in the air like smoke. Warren leaned back, expecting applause to grow louder. Instead, the room went strangely quiet. President Traore adjusted his headset, his voice calm, steady, yet carrying the weight of a storm. "Senator," he said softly but firmly, "when Wall Street collapsed in 2008, your government spent trillions to rescue bankers who gambled with people's lives. That was the real cause. America bailed out greed and called it economics." Gasps filled the chamber. The words cut deep. Warren blinked, her smirk fading into tight silence. Meanwhile, Traore continued, his eyes unwavering. "We are building roads, schools, and hospitals with the little we have. That is not cosplay, Senator. That is survival. That is dignity." His words traveled across oceans, entering millions of living rooms. For a moment, the Senate chamber felt smaller, weaker, like history itself had tilted. Warren's lips trembled as she tried to respond, but her voice cracked. The cameras caught everything. Twitter lit up instantly. Hashtags spread. Clips were replayed. The clapback had only begun. Within minutes, the video clip went viral. Social media erupted. A Traore trended worldwide. In Africa, young people flooded the streets with cheers, proud to see one of their own stand tall against a U.S. senator. In the U.S., the reaction was split. Some praised Warren for challenging Traore, but many more were stunned by how brutally and gracefully she had been silenced. News anchors scrambled to cover the breaking story. "A powerful exchange unlike anything we've seen before," one declared. Another whispered, "Did we just watch history?" But in the Senate chamber, the tension only grew heavier. Warren's face turned pale. She reached for her water glass, her hands shaking. Cameras zoomed in, catching the tear that slid down her cheek. No one clapped anymore. No one laughed. President Traore sat there unshaken. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply folded his hands and waited like a teacher watching a noisy class fall into silence. The moment was unforgettable. Yet this was only the beginning. More would unfold in the coming days, more than anyone was ready for. The Senate room grew heavier with every second of silence. No one dared to cough, whisper, or move. Warren stared at the table, her fingers trembling against her pen. A senator beside her leaned in, trying to whisper something, but she waved him away, embarrassed. President Traore sat still on the massive screen, his expression steady. He didn't press the moment. He didn't need to. The silence itself had already crowned him victorious. Reporters in the back began typing furiously. Headlines were being born in real time. Cameras zoomed in on Warren's watery eyes, capturing the moment America's most seasoned lawmaker looked fragile before a young African president. And in Ouagadougou, people had gathered in cafes, homes, and small offices watching the live broadcast. Some clapped, some cried. Many just shook their heads, whispering, "At last, someone said it." It wasn't just about the words. It was about the dignity, the calm power, the refusal to be shaken. What happened in that chamber would not stay in that chamber. It was already racing across the world like fire in dry grass. When Elizabeth Warren lifted her head again, the cameras caught it, one tear sliding down her cheek. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't staged. It was raw, human, and painfully visible. For a woman known for her toughness, it was shattering. Some senators averted their eyes out of pity. Others leaned forward, not knowing whether to console her or distance themselves. President Traoré did not smirk. He did not gloat. Instead, he lowered his voice and said something few expected. "Senator, this is not about humiliation. It is about truth. And truth is often painful." Those words struck harder than the clapback itself. They weren't cruel. They were fatherly, like a teacher correcting a child in front of the whole class. On social media, the tear became the symbol of the moment. Memes, headlines, and emotional posts flooded every platform. Some mocked Warren, but many sympathized, saying she was humbled by truth itself. And behind the screens, millions of young Africans felt tears in their own eyes. Not from pity, but from pride. For the first time, they saw someone stand unshaken before the mighty U.S. Senate. Outside the Capitol, the air was electric. Protesters had already gathered before the hearing, holding signs about fair trade, debt relief, and African sovereignty. Now, after Traoré's words, their chants grew louder, their numbers swelling. News crews rushed to capture the moment. "This isn't just politics," one journalist whispered. "This is a storm." In Burkina Faso, drums echoed in neighborhoods as youth groups celebrated. WhatsApp groups flooded with clips. Mothers hugged their children tighter, whispering, "Look at him. This is the kind of leader we prayed for." But not everyone was celebrating. Inside Washington, advisors scrambled. Phone calls were made to the White House, to Wall Street, to think tanks. The question was urgent. What if this young man becomes the voice of a new Africa? And back in the chamber, Elizabeth Warren excused herself for a moment, stepping out quietly, head low. The cameras followed her, but the story was no longer about her alone. It was about the clash of dignity and arrogance, about a young leader whose words could not be contained within the walls of the Senate. This was only day one. That night, Washington didn't sleep. Inside a dimly lit room at a Georgetown townhouse, lobbyists, senators, and foreign policy advisors gathered nervously. Phones buzzed nonstop. Clips of Traoré's words had reached every corner of the globe. One advisor slammed his fist on the table. He turned her words into a weapon, and the world sided with him. This is dangerous. If his voice keeps growing, he'll change how people see Africa. Another replied, shaking his head. It's too late. That moment is already bigger than us. We can't silence the internet. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Warren sat silently in her hotel suite. The bravado was gone. She stared at the screen, replaying her tear, her humiliation over and over. For the first time in years, she looked small, breakable, and across the ocean in Ouagadougou. President Traoré ended his day in prayer. He wasn't celebrating victory. He whispered quietly, "God, give me strength to carry this weight. It is not for me. It is for my people." 2 rooms, 2 worlds, one clash that had shaken the balance of power. The next morning, Burkina Faso woke up to a new dawn. In the streets of Ouagadougou, school children wore small paper badges with Traoré's face. Taxi drivers played radio talk shows repeating his words with pride. In villages far from the capital, elders sat under trees listening to battery-powered radios. When they heard how he stood before the U.S. Senate unafraid, tears streamed down their weathered faces. Finally, one old man whispered, "Someone speaks for us with courage." But it wasn't only in Africa. Across Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East, ordinary people shared the clip, calling Traoré a symbol of dignity. Meanwhile, in Boston, Warren's hometown, newspapers headlined, "Elizabeth Warren humbled." Some were sympathetic, others brutal. She avoided public appearances, her team begging her to stay off social media. The world's eyes were no longer on her. They were on him. For Burkina Faso, a nation often ignored, this felt like resurrection. Hope spread faster than fear. And in every cafe, every household, people said the same thing. This is only the beginning. By midweek, the ripple effect had reached global institutions. At the World Bank's headquarters, staff whispered about the speech. At the African Union, leaders replayed the clip, exchanging proud smiles. In Paris, the French media, long critical of Traoré, faced backlash from African diasporas who demanded fair coverage. A young student outside the French embassy held a sign that read, "Respect our leaders. Respect our dignity." In Washington, senators were uneasy. They hadn't expected a simple trade hearing to spiral into a cultural earthquake. Some quietly admitted that Traoré's words had exposed uncomfortable truths about U.S. policy. But what made the world emotional wasn't politics. It was humanity. People felt the authenticity in his voice, the sharp pain in his truth. Elizabeth Warren released a short statement, but it backfired. It sounded defensive, cold, and disconnected. Meanwhile, Traoré didn't release anything. His silence spoke louder than press releases, and so the world kept replaying the moment. Millions cried watching it, not for Warren's embarrassment, but because they saw dignity win against arrogance. By day 3, it was clear this was not just news. This was history in motion. Late that evening, Traoré's phone rang. It was his mother, her voice trembling through the line from a quiet village in Burkina Faso. She had watched the broadcast, surrounded by neighbors. "My son," she said softly, "you carried the dignity of our ancestors today. But remember, when the world claps, it also plots. Walk carefully." Traoré closed his eyes. He wasn't afraid, but he understood. Respect brings both admiration and enemies. He thanked her, promising to remain humble. Back in Washington, Elizabeth Warren sat at her desk, drafting a private apology letter. She tore it up 3 times before giving up. Every word felt hollow. She had never felt this powerless before. Meanwhile, across Africa, artists painted murals of Traoré. Poets wrote verses and radio presenters replayed his speech like a song. In markets, vendors named their stalls Rising Africa, inspired by his words. This was no longer just a political exchange. It had become something spiritual, something that touched hearts across borders. But with every hour, pressure mounted in Washington. Some whispered that Traoré had to be handled. Others feared that silencing him would make him even louder. The stage was set for something even bigger. On the 3rd day, the Senate gathered again. The atmosphere was uneasy, almost hostile. Elizabeth Warren was present. Her eyes tired, her voice restrained. Some senators wanted to dismiss the incident, to pretend it never happened. Others demanded an explanation, worried about America's global image. But when the committee tried to continue with regular business, protesters outside erupted louder than ever. Chants of Africa Rising echoed through the streets. Reporters swarmed the building, asking tough questions no senator wanted to answer. Inside, a younger senator from California whispered, "Maybe we underestimated him. Maybe the world is changing and we don't control the story anymore." Elizabeth Warren shifted uncomfortably, her hands clenched under the table. She wasn't angry anymore. She was shaken, humbled. For the first time in decades, she doubted her place in history. And across the video link, Traoré appeared again, calm as ever. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. "Senators," he began, "I am not here to defeat you. I am here to remind you that partnership must mean respect. Without that, trade is just another chain." The words landed heavier than stones. The silence returned. That same evening, a well-known American journalist, Maria Torres, prepared her evening broadcast. She had covered wars, scandals, and presidential campaigns. But something about this story broke her. As she replayed Traoré's speech on air, her voice cracked. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Live before millions of viewers," she admitted. "I have reported on Africa for 20 years. Never have I heard a leader speak with such raw honesty. Tonight I cry not out of pity, but out of hope." Clips of her tears went viral. People across the world were touched. This wasn't just Africans cheering. Even voices within America were moved. In Burkina Faso, families gathered around televisions and radios, their hearts swelling. Mothers told their children, "Study hard, walk tall. If he can speak for us, you too can speak one day." Elizabeth Warren watched the broadcast from her hotel room. Her chest tightened. For the first time, she saw the story not through her pride, but through the eyes of millions. The world had shifted in just days, and Warren knew her tear in the Senate was only the beginning of a much deeper reckoning. On the 4th day, as Washington buzzed with debates, an unexpected letter reached Traoré's office. It wasn't from a president or a diplomat. It was from a 14-year-old girl in Detroit named Aisha. She wrote in careful handwriting, "Dear President Traoré, I watched you on TV. When you spoke, I cried. My father lost his job when the banks collapsed and nobody cared. But you cared. You told the truth. Thank you. The letter was simple, but it broke everyone in the room. Traoré read it twice, then placed it gently on his desk. He whispered, "This is why I speak." He asked his staff to send a reply handwritten by him, assuring Aisha that voices like hers matter too. News of the letter leaked to the press. Soon it was everywhere. People wept reading her words. It wasn't just an African story anymore. It was global, human, and painfully real. And in that moment, Elizabeth Warren realized the fight was no longer political. She had unintentionally unlocked something deeper, something that connected the struggles of poor families in America with those in Africa. The world was now bound by one young girl's truth. By day 5, the debate had grown too loud to ignore. In New York, hundreds gathered outside the United Nations building holding candles. They weren't protesting. They were mourning decades of arrogance in silence and celebrating dignity at last. Inside, diplomats whispered about inviting Traoré to speak at the UN General Assembly. Others resisted fiercely, saying his voice was too disruptive. But disruption was exactly what people craved. In Washington, Elizabeth Warren finally broke her silence. She called a press conference. Cameras flashed as she walked up to the podium, looking weary but sincere. "I mocked a man I should have listened to," she admitted. "And in my arrogance, I disrespected millions who live with less but carry more dignity than we ever imagined. For that, I am sorry." The room gasped. Some applauded, others stared in shock. Her apology wasn't scripted. It came from a place of defeat and truth. President Traoré, when asked to respond, simply said, "Apologies are meaningful when they lead to change." Time will tell. His restraint, his refusal to humiliate her further, moved millions to tears. It was no longer about clapping back. It was about healing. On the 6th day, the Senate reconvened. But before business began, something unusual happened. An elder senator from the Midwest stood up and requested a moment of silence. The chamber bowed their heads. No cameras flashed. No words were spoken for one full minute. Silence reigned in honor of dignity, humility, and truth. Some senators wiped tears. Elizabeth Warren lowered her head, hands clasped tightly. She wasn't thinking about politics. She was thinking about her father, who had worked 2 jobs and still struggled, much like the families Traoré spoke for. When the silence ended, a chaplain whispered a prayer. "May those who hold power never forget the powerless. May truth humble us all." The words shook the chamber. They weren't about winning or losing. They were about remembering humanity. Across the ocean, Traoré was shown the clip of the prayer. He closed his eyes, nodding slowly. "This," he murmured, "is the beginning of something greater than me." The story was no longer about one man, one senator, or one country. It had become a global mirror, and everyone was forced to look inside. On the 7th morning, something remarkable happened. Across Africa, school children were recorded standing in their classrooms reciting Traoré's words. "Africa is rising while your empire cries poor." Teachers wept openly, watching 10-year-olds speak lines that carried the weight of centuries. Videos flooded social media showing children from Ghana to Kenya to South Africa repeating his message with bright eyes and trembling voices. One clip stood out. A barefoot boy in Burkina Faso standing in a dusty classroom saying, "We are not costumes. We are the future." The video went viral instantly. Even Americans shared it with captions like, "This child speaks more truth than our politicians." When Traoré saw the footage, he pressed his palm to his chest. He whispered, "If I fall tomorrow, it will not matter. They have already risen." Meanwhile, Elizabeth Warren watched the same clip from her office. Tears rolled down her cheeks again, but this time they weren't of humiliation. They were of understanding. She realized the battle was never her versus him. It was truth versus pride, and truth had already won. That afternoon, Washington was shaken again. Elizabeth Warren requested a private meeting with President Traoré. It was arranged quickly away from cameras in a quiet conference room at the Senate. When Warren entered, her eyes were swollen but determined. Traoré stood, greeted her with a nod, and waited. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then Warren spoke. "I mocked you because I feared you, but you didn't answer with hate. You answered with dignity. You reminded me what leadership is supposed to look like." Her voice cracked and she wiped her eyes. "I am 76 and I still have much to learn." Traoré listened carefully, then said, "Senator, power without humility destroys nations.